I thought we'd go over another exciting game from the Tata still. Please do keep your votes coming in on these Tata still videos for what games you want video annotated. This one had already been mentioned before, so I think it's been mentioned by 2 or 3 of you actually, and it's interesting because Levon has a different style to Naka. It's like strategic bias, and Naka's got a more dynamic tactical bias. So seeing that those kind of views come together on chessboard, it is a fascinating struggle. So after d4, actually we see the Dutch defence as well, which is not so often played at the top levels of 2700 plus GMs. You really need to know what you're doing if you're going to play the Dutch. As I found out recently, you do need to know a lot of theory about even Bishop G5, as well as other gambits and stuff like the Staunton gambit, like E4. So there's a lot of stuff you need to know to be able to play the Dutch. But one of the exciting variations, if White does play kind of the fianchetto system, is to play the fluid Leningrad system, the Leningrad Dutch. And the Leningrad also fianchettos a bishop actually with G6. Okay, so, and the idea later is usually something like D6, and then maybe C6, Knight A6 to C7, Queen E8 and E5, E4. That's one of the sort of standard sort of template plans in the Leningrad Dutch. So how did this game turn out? So Knight F3, Bishop G7, both sides now castle, C4, and D6 was played here. There's no real problem with D5. I think Black can get away with E5, and if takes C6 and then gather this pawn at leisure. Okay, let's just make sure of that, just in case. So I think E5 is possible without a problem. It's not really mentioned as a big deal. C6, oh dear, Knight G5, Knight A6. Is the pawn going to be rounded up? I hope so. Eventually it can be rounded up. This is a computer line to try and refute it. Whoa! Going off topic here. Okay, maybe there's a safer thing to do here instead of a temporary pawn sack. Possibly just Knight A6 then, or Knight D7. Or there's another idea in fact here, Knight E4. So that stops the natural Knight C3. And after Knight C5, now we can safely gather the pawn. Maybe that's worth bearing in mind if you're a Leningrad Dutch player. Okay, so Knight E4, interesting. Not C6. Knight E4 is given as stronger by Houdini, for those interested. So anyway, so there's a temptation to seal E6, but this is more theoretical now. Knight C3, C6 now. So it does make way for this knight maneuver. Where else could the knight have gone, you might ask? Why is it actually necessary? It could be necessary because if you play the natural Knight D7, then I think here actually D5 is starting to gain more impact, because now there's Knight D4, and that really starts to put restraints on these two pawns. So here I do think D5 is a very strong move here. Or am I wrong? D5, there's Knight C5. Or maybe even stronger, just Knight G5, as the engine suggests, to go to E6. Threaten to go to E6. And the knight is forced to retreat, maybe, if it doesn't go to B8, if it goes to B6. Now Queen B3 threatens unsubtle things like C5 check, and then winning the exchange. So C5, DC, DC. Let's have a look at this. So this would be quite unpleasant. for black. So that's why, okay, not knight d7, which you might consider as a move. So instead c6. Okay, so queen b3 was played, which goes onto that sensitive diagonal, and this is the more modern sort of continuation than what used to be played, which I think a lot of time players would play queen c2 with a logical basis maybe to try and play e4 in the future, or just you know, fianchetto over here, or play even bishop a3. But queen b3 is more aggressive actually, and this maneuver to a3, it was mentioned, well, there was this consultation game on Chessgames.com against Arno Nickel, and it was mentioned as from a cautionary game reference that cautionary played this strange queen maneuver to a3, which does put pressure on this diagonal, and later, you know, b4 b5 maybe, and pressure on the queen side. So king h8 was played here to avoid any troublesome c5 checks, and also to be able to answer knight g5 with h6 without any problem. So rook d1, now knight a6, and the queen does go to a3, so it unblocks the b pawn, facilitates b4, and generally, you know, it ties down black a bit, you know, a7, bit of pressure on this diagonal. And if black's plan is usually to play e for e5, it's disrupted as well here. That's another benefit of this, that the usual, you know, stereotypical queen e8 and e5 is clearly ruled out because of d6 being eyed from a3. So this idea of the queen b3 to a3, I think it stems from cautionary. Knight c7, and like in the Nickel game, you know, Nickel just kept solid. He waited for white to play some pawn moves. d5, c5, which clearly does provide an undermining target. Actually, I think in the Arnold Nickel game, something like bishop d7 might have been played instead of c5. c5 does offer a clear target for b4. So let's actually just quickly examine, was c5 actually necessary? Or even cd, pardon me, cd or bishop d7? Is there a problem with cd? Now bishop d7, and the game might continue like this. White enjoys an advantage here apparently. It does look quite good. It looks as though black's queen side is under pressure, but or is black okay on the queen side? A move like a3 here marks out b4 and actually threatens some evil manoeuvres. Like when I play Yes or So on the OCC, there's a sort of evil maneuver to b4. But you know, there's a positional bind here of some sort. So maybe if we go back without the computer freezing to this position, bishop d7 is an alternative. I think that might actually be one of the more solid alternatives. So say knight g5, which might be threatening something quite subtle. Saying h6. Okay, just provoking a weakness, because now actually knight h4, for example. So this position, it's slightly better for white anyway. So the committal, let's go back, the committal move c5 was played, more committal anyway, encouraging the potential for b4. And okay, so the strategic nature of the position has changed. It looks initially as though this shouldn't be a big deal because black can get a nice blockade point on c5 with tempo if he just takes. So that's what happened. Black took, played knight a6, Queen went back to b1, but not knight c5 here. Instead, bishop d7 was played by Naka. So, okay, the clear question here is, why not the natural knight c5? You might be asking. If knight c5 here, given about equal actually. So bishop d7 is very interesting as well, offering, I guess the b7 pawn is a sort of poison pawn of some sort. Queen a5 gives black activity, hitting c3 immediately, and that looks like dangerous activity. Black might be better in fact in that line. So okay, so bishop d7. Now knight b5 looks like a fine positional maneuver, just to get a knight back to d4 potentially. Rook c8, so c4 is a little bit vulnerable here. It's protected. And now queen b6, it looks as though black's doing okay on the queen side. Also, of course, the knight was hitting a7 here, so queen b6 protects a7 and might introduce even some threats like knight g4 if white's not careful. Maybe f2 might be an issue. The rook's move from f2. So queen b6, okay. And now this move e3, which we've seen in some other high-level games of Carlsen playing e3, and we wondered why in that game. Well, here, as well as f2 being less vulnerable to the gaze of the queen, it does sort of virtually, as someone pointed out, extend the scope of the bishop. And as we worked out in some analysis, that the bishop given bishop f1 is also often useful. So it seems as though white's weakening some light squares with e3, but also it makes f4 more difficult to achieve as well. So it's strengthening control of f4. So overall, these pluses and minuses of the move e3, maybe it's like an overall plus. It's been judged to be an overall plus. Fixing f4, giving the bishop some options, avoiding the gaze on f2. Okay, so Naka plays knight c5. Now, interestingly, a4 is played, knowing that this a4 pawn is going to be a target of these two guys, potentially, and even the queen maybe, like the next move prompts, queen a5. Okay, so a4 is a bit loose, and this knight's kind of tied down to c4. So initially you might think, well, actually, you know, maybe black's doing quite well. Aronian's not afraid to temporarily sacrifice a pawn here. He plays bishop a3, and I think it will be far too dangerous for black to snatch the a4 pawn here. Let's just check that out. It looks as though that's just ridiculous, going into a pin potentially. Bishop, but there's no actual crushing move. Bishop b4, queen a6, or is there? Knight c3 or queen b3. Knight seems as though it's in the bad spot. Tactically, there's rook takes c4 here, funny enough, to undermine the b5 knight. But it's still a small advantage apparently for white. Bishop takes b5 as well. No, white's just a piece up here. That's no good. So anyway, no, black's not at the moment interested in munching a4. He kicks the knight with a6 on b5. Knight refuses to move back just yet. Bishop b4, kicking the queen back, all the way back to d8. Now the knight leisurely reroutes to d4, but of course a4 looks tempting again. Why not take it here? That's what happened. Knight takes a4. So what's going on here after knight takes a4? It looks again like a kind of positional pawn sacrifice for white to get the light square bishop, this one, and also extend the scope of his bishop with this next move, knight e6. So temporarily a pawn down, but he's extending the scope of his pieces, and also this pawn, you know, could be quite dangerous on e6. It kind of dislocates a little bit black's communication of his pieces. Okay, and gives of course the d5 square potential access, but the main thing I think is this diagonal to regain the pawn with advantage. So bishop takes e6, d takes e6. So b7 is now eyed, and of course not only that, the knight is now threatened. It was being protected by the bishop. So what's going to be done about this knight? Naka chooses queen e8 just to protect it, inviting his b7 pawn to drop. And surely you might ask, well, this is going to backfire, isn't it, taking on b7, because the queen's on b1. Isn't there going to be a backfiring of pins here on the b file? Surely not. So we've entered a long dialogue transaction of some forcing moves to regain material, starting from initial pawn sacrifice. To regain the pawn will involve going into self pins. So this is what happens now. Bishop takes b7, going into self pins, two bishops with a queen unfortunately placed on b1. Looks a little bit like a very strange position to be in. Okay, so bishop takes a6, yes, a pawn up, and if white's given another move, bishop b5 comfortable, blocking the b file and even winning material. But it's black's turn, as Bronstein would say, and that's often a big advantage whose turn it is. And here black can play a forcing move which seems very, very useful. Not just a humble retreat like knight c5, which doesn't work anyway because of bishop b5, but actually play this next forcing move, knight c3, exploiting that pin on the bishop and forking of course queen and rook, and virtually forcing actually white's next move. White hasn't got many moves here, only queen b3, because queen c2 just taken and take on b4. Queen c2, black just takes on d1 and then would be taking on d4. So the only way out of this to be just the exchange down is this line, which I checked out earlier. So the exchange down, you might think, well, this is playable, isn't it? But e6 will drop in this line and black will be slightly better. There's pressure on the queen side. It's not much for the exchange. So basically, in this critical position, Levon decides that actually it's better to go for the rook and knight here and give up the queen. And this is a really interesting decision. White does have the two bishops after, and still maintains this pawn, it seems, and controls the b file. So there's some dynamic factors here. So bishop takes c3, offering the queen. So rook d takes b1. And you might be wondering, what is the engine evaluation here? Also, it's for a pawn, isn't it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we've got the bishop pair. We've got control of the b file. We've got an annoying pawn on e6, which is difficult in this position to sort of attack. We've also got this kind of potentially weak king if the bishops are exchanged off. But what is the engine evaluation here of this queen sack? Actually, it's about equal. It's given just virtually about equal. So it's still a complicated position to start off with, it seems. So a lot is going to depend on the coordination, the successful coordination or otherwise, of the white pieces here. Maybe the use of the 7th rank. If white can start to get some pawns at some point, that'll be helpful. Now it looks as though the f file with that rook on f8 needs the rook to expand. There's a loss to expand. So playing for f4 would seem tempting here, even though g5 you wouldn't normally consider it. But here g5 was actually played. Try and get this f4 break, extend the scope of the rook. Now the rook to the 7th, which Nimzovich has mentioned a lot in my system, getting rooks to the 7th rank, where statistically there's not only pawns to attack, but you're also restricting the king in the end game. Offering now an exchange of the dark square bishops leaves black maybe a slightly more vulnerable on the dark squares, but white's lost the bishop pair, of course, and white's weaker on the dark squares too. So it really depends on which side has more initiative, maybe, to exploit the weaknesses. There are a couple of pawns now in a row, which is kind of highlighted now with Levon's next move, rook b5, because actually there might be the idea of rook a5 with a rook battery to try and munch one of these pawns. Queen g6, as though f4 is still on the cards, and trying to prevent any g takes in return, because the queen pointing at the king. Now, interestingly, c5, which, okay, it brings some scope for this bishop back on this diagonal if needed. Also, e6 was attacked. You might have also noticed that's another benefit of queen g6. e6 was attacked. So what is going on here? If queen takes e6 here, then maybe there's the option of c6. Maybe that's a strong move. Let's just check that out. c6 is given as one of the stronger moves, but for some reason an advantage to black. But I'm not sure I believe an engine evaluation here, because they're often underestimating past pawns. If we just follow this a little bit forward, d5, it's getting a bit less. Bishop b7 supporting the passed pawn. No rush unless the king side storm is too much to bear. E takes, g takes. We're approaching almost equality sometimes. Nope. It looks from an engine point of view, honestly, as if black might have a slightly better position. Tiny little bit better. Tiny. Now you might ask why. Queen e2, knight f2. Now clearly here this looks quite dangerous for both sides actually, with this passed pawn. Too scary to play, I think, for both sides. What is going on here? Queen b6, that apparently... Oh, this is just an engine line, engine fantasy. No idea. Forget it. It's about equal there in that engine fantasy line. But in the actual game, actually, after c5, Naka just simply took on c5. So rook takes, queen takes e6, much simpler than handling that passed pawn, getting to dangerous proportions. And we're about equal again. So here, what's going on? What are the success factors for both sides? Well, black's liberation on the f file, some sort of eyeing of f2 could be handy here. Is white going to improve the knight with this sort of stuff, and try and get into the 7th rank, try and get to the black king. So maybe both sides fundamentally want to get to each other's kings, the other person's king. Knight f3, queen d6. Now not moving the rook, but indirectly defending it with knight d4. Because if queen takes, then we have a nice fork, knight e6 check, winning the queen. Okay, so it's a really tricky, dynamic position. Materially, we're equal on pawns now, of course, after black had snatched that e6 pawn. And essentially it's rook and knight versus queen. If we factor out the other pieces, so rook and bishop for rook and knight there, it's rook and knight versus queen, which technically you'd usually give queen 9, not 10, so technically black is ahead in material if we're using a raw count, but in the situation here, which is quite dynamic, it seems tricky for black. King h8 was played, because what to do about f5? These two pawns are actually quite vulnerable. In fact, f5 is vulnerable, and there might actually be a problem with e6, like like rook c6, just to support f5. So actually, King h8 also kind of sets this drawing trap, I think, or rather just trap, because there's a loose rook here. I don't think the pawn can be taken without a tactical disaster occurring. Rook takes f5, rook takes, knight takes. Just wondering about something like queen f6. Okay, there's knight d4 in return. Okay, that's okay. Alright, that would save white. But Levon wasn't interested in taking that pawn here. After king h8, he keeps control of the position more with rook c6. So queen d7 now doubles rook simply on the c file for rook c7 to be facilitated. He wants to get back on that 7th rank. And now Necker uses that breakthrough move f4, extending the scope of his rook, trying to get onto white's king, loosen some dark squares. The calm bishop c8 is used now, a benefit of those doubled rooks on the c file. Queen a7. Okay. As though the knight is tied down because the queen's kind of eyeing this diagonal, but the knight moves anyway cheekily, saying, I don't care about the queen, gazing down this diagonal. And in fact, here is an interesting test. Can a rook be sacrificed here to test this queen's influence here? If we check this variation, f takes, this is quite interesting as a rook sack. E takes. Now, in this position, white would have to be accurate to play king f1, apparently, because this could be actually very interesting for black after queen e3, with the idea of queen e1. So even though white's a lot of material up, queen e1, and there's a lot of trouble at mill here because of f1 being threatened. So say bishop a6, now knight f6, and it's starting to get really tricky. Like this, and black will be better in this position. It's all about coordination really, and king safety versus material sometimes. So so queen a7 anyway, knight e6, the rook actually moved. Necker didn't go in for this rook sack because basically anyway white could play king f1, and technically this is much safer than that continuation. But the rook moved, which allows white to win maybe a key pawn here. You know, it just takes. Now, not taking on f4 immediately. Of course, there's like rook takes c6. first attacking the queen and then to play knight takes f4. So, has white improved the position, winning just one pawn now, one pawn advantage? These pawns look a bit fragmented, and there's an issue, it seems, cropping up for black's king safety. Black's king seems a little bit more vulnerable than before. Rook d6, bishop e6, especially now that this bishop's pointed at g8 with rook c8 in the air now. But surely Naka's getting a pair of rooks off, that's useful surely here now, this configuration, without whites being able to double rooks anymore. Will the rook, bishop, knight really seriously be able to overcome the queen and knight? The problem is the knight's kind of passive here and is being used in a very defensive role. White's king is quite safe. The knight tries to come out, but is kind of put back in the box pretty soon after rook takes e7. If it did try and venture out to help the queen here, I think there's serious trouble. The black king could end up being mated. So let's say knight e4 as an example. So bishop f5 pointing at the black king, going for the white king, check. The king can make a run for it here apparently with king h3, which is not that outrageous because something similar happens in the game, king h3. Rook b7, okay, the knight and queen, you might think they're coordinating, but actually if the king's making a run for it, in fact going to the black king, the black king's getting quite dangerously under fire, even from the white king helping the free pieces here. Engine verdict, white's better here anyway. So, in the game, rook takes e7, queen e1 was played, eyeing that f2. Rook f7 now, and here it looks as though, isn't knight e4 like dangerous here, you might ask, in this position? Knight e4, getting frozen here, oh dear. Let's turn that off. Okay, let's just follow the game a bit. Check, and the king safety takes an interesting turn after king h3. Okay, so queen e5, and staggeringly, I don't know how many of us would consider such a move, but I guess there's a threat here that black has of knight h5. To undermine all of white's pieces, and this next move ticks the box for kind of maybe neutralizing such a threat, if that really is a threat, or is there another key reason that queen e6 will not be check? In fact, I think that is the more of the key reason, that if knight takes, we've got queen e6 as check. So this next move takes the king away from such a possibility, which means that although knight h5 is technically possible, it would end up, this is not check and this is mate, or rather winning the queen after queen g8. So king h4 maybe is designed against this knight h5 threat, but it seems a little bit crazy of a move to play king h4, but apparently it's one of the strongest engine moves in the position. Does severely limit black's counterplay. So king h4 prophylaxis against knight h5 and stuff. Queen d4, and now another very, very, very strong move is played here. Not only unpinning the knight, but also with this next move, there's a threat clearly of rook f8 check, king g7, and knight e6. Well, the knight's not pinned anyway. which would be forking king and queen there. So queen e5 was played. Now knight e6, which threatens the vicious rook f8. So if knight takes g4, rook f8. So the knight's a mating that unfortunately is being weaved ruthlessly around the black king. So it seems a little bit funny that just two minor pieces basically for the queen are so effectual in this position and so dangerous. So black decided to play h6, and unfortunately after rook f8 check, is convinced that king h7 is a bad idea, and instead goes into a horrible self-pin with knight g8. So we have to ask, okay, what is going on after king h7? f4. I guess bishop f5 check is the problem. Queen b5, or is it rook f7 check? No, just taking the knight is easy enough. Okay, so the knight has to go into this horrible self-pin then. f4 is played anyway here, kicking the queen off that nice central square. Queen b2, sent into oblivion. Okay, it's attacking the h2 pawn, but now the king comes just to defend that. Queen a1, and now unfortunately coordination increases here after bishop h5. The bishop is coming in to help the rook to munch the knight. King h7, king driven back into the corner, and now instead of that previous plan of trying to win the knight, going for it, bishop g6, threatening mate. Knight f6, parrying that mate threat, but again putting the knight back into the pin. And now we reach that earlier idea, bishop f7. Horrible stuff, winning material by force. And here Naka decided enough is enough and resigned. So let's just make sure of this. I mean, let's give some example here. So say king h7 takes 3 pieces now for the queen, and it's actually a forced mate in 10. I wonder if you can spot it. It's a forced mate in 10. f5, check, f6, you might think, hang on, what about queen? This would be a quick mate, knight f8. That's pretty. Whoa. So this pawn coming to f6, pretty dangerous. Queen d7. Now to form part of the mating 4, the king move to h4 is quite amusing. So now I think what is going here is basically this threat of rook g8 and knight f8 is a killer threat. So that was just unpinning the knight. So this is delaying just rook g8s. But now bishop g6 can be chosen. Check. Check. Well, that's just forcing the loss of the queen now. So this f pawn is decisive. So in that final position, to summarise there, f pawn looks as though that's, after winning that 3 pieces, the f pawn comes up decisively here. Okay, so fascinating struggle. So let's look in overview and summary now. So Leningrad Dutch played with Korchnoi plan, Queen b3 to a3, which puts a dampener on black's sort of stereotypical plans of Queen e8 and e5. Instead we get a very interesting dynamic transaction here of soon of white offering a kind of positional pawn sack, his a4 pawn coming up, trying to get it back, going into a self pin, leading to a queen sack for rook and knight versus queen. which leads to a very unclear position where certain factors like winning a key pawn would be maybe turning the position, or black's king safety. It turns out that the f4 pawn was very useful to win, and here it seems as though black did start to be slightly worse with his king exposed, even after a couple of rooks came off. The knight, it seems, couldn't have helped the queen, but rather was in a defensive posture. This king h4, a key prophylaxis idea, giving rise to some pretty nasty possibilities. Now, so the knight actually driven back, just really defensive knight, and then white forcibly kind of winning a third piece, which Necker kind of resigned here. So comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.